I'm Emilie. We're here with Will McKay, who is one of the writers and responsible for most of the development of the language of Chahi in Makasing and the world of Coyote Crow.
Tanshi, Dishinikashan Will. My name is Will McKay. Again, I was one of the developers for Coyote Crow. Been really pleased to write with it over the last few years. I'm Métis, originally from Calgary, Alberta. My family is from the Red River Valley in the area around Winnipeg, Manitoba. I live now in the States, but it's great to be here, and thanks for giving me some time to talk about Chahi and the world of Coyote Crow.
Can you tell us about your background in gaming, and have you been in game development before, or for very long?
Yeah, so my first entry into game development was through a woman named Beth Lepensi, who runs a group for Indigenous game developers on Facebook. So she's Métis like me, connected on there, and she invited me to write for a game called When Rivers Were Trails. The idea was it was sort of an Indigenous Oregon Trail. We were telling the story of an Indigenous person traveling westward during the time of kind of dispossession and colonization. So I wrote a few stories for that, telling some of the stories from my grandpa, from my ancestry, from, different Indigenous people who meant a lot to me. And from there, just kept engaging in the community. And that's eventually where I met Connor and got connected to Coyote Crow.
That sounds really cool. What is your background with languages? Do you know a few of them? Or did you learn a lot growing up?
I was actually terrible with language growing up. I did Spanish in high school. My grandpa spoke Michif and French, so he would teach me little pieces. But it wasn't really until I got to college that I gained an appreciation for languages. So I started taking Arabic in my freshman year, and it was a language that was just constructed so differently than any of the other languages I was used to. And it had this really interesting system for how words were put together. You have these kind of patterns and these roots that carry meaning, and they can be subtly changed with just different vowels to create entirely different words out of the same basic sounds in an almost kind of mechanical way. And it just opened my eyes to the different kinds of things languages can do. And I think especially around that time, this was around when my grandfather, who was Will McKay, he was a Métis historian, documentarian, but he started getting sick. And as he was passing away, that's when I really started connecting with my mom's side of the family and appreciating that heritage more than I had before. And, he had given me a book on Ojibwe language, right? Our family's Métis, which is this Canadian kind of blend between French, Scottish fur traders and Cree, Ojibwe, Sioux, Assiniboine, Lakota, all these different tribes coming together in this particular region of Canada. And so he had given me a book on the Ojibwe language that a good friend of his had given him, and I started looking at that, and that then started opening my eyes up to Indigenous languages. So I'm started doing some Métis language learning now, and that was the angle that I approached Coyote and Crow from, really having come to a point where I appreciated different languages and appreciated what languages could do for Indigenous communities and wanting to make sure that was reflected in the world. And then part of that too was connected to the work that I've been doing, or I had been doing for the last few years, which was directly tied to Indigenous language revitalization. So seeing again firsthand the way that languages were impacting communities and the way that Indigenous languages, the role they had to play in those communities, again, that was another piece that I really wanted to bring to the game and make sure that we were doing some small part to shine a spotlight on these languages and just have people think about language as a part of the world.
Yeah, that's awesome. I just started learning Cree last year.
Oh, cool.
And it's crazy. Same thing, unlike any language I've ever heard.
Right.
But it's so cool. So what would you say were some of the biggest challenges of creating the language in the game?
one of the biggest challenges was, again, I'm not a professional linguist. And so a lot of this was me learning things as I went. And really that's how it goes with any language. It's always that process of discovering and learning, because there's so much that language can do, and no conlanger is ever going to be able to create something that's, as full and robust as languages that have been around for thousands of years and have been developing and growing from other ones, right? So you're always learning new features, you're always learning new complications. And I think one of the big challenges for me was, as I developed something, making sure it was consistent with everything that had come before, especially when you're dealing with a team of creatives and everyone's got their own heritage, everyone's has their own background, everyone has their own languages, right, that they're coming up and coming with, and they want to see those reflected in the game too. So trying to figure out a way to blend those syncretically and believably was a challenge, but it was a really fun one to work through. And I think in some of the places where we've got imperfections in the language or apparent contradictions, those are things that happen in real world languages too. And they've actually helped, I think, deepen the world building in some ways, where an old spelling system that we used has kind of remained in words that ended up taking a really prominent role in the world. We can explain some of that by saying, all right, well, this word actually came from a different language than a lot of the roots. That's why it looks a little different. That's why we're spelling it this way or pronouncing it that way, when that's not how we pronounce other words in the language, right? Because this is not just the story of Cahokia, this is the story of an entire continent of different kinds of people who are all meeting in one place.
Yeah, that's awesome. What would be something that you want people to know about the language?
Yeah, I think the real world history behind the language is really important to me. So, like I said, I'm Métis. I come from an Indigenous community in Canada that's really diverse, and my family is from the Red River area of Manitoba, which is the heartland of the Métis people. And it was this really interesting conflux where settlers and people who be identified as colonizers came into contact with Indigenous people, but it wasn't the same kind of violent conflict that we see in so many other places where that meeting happens. And instead what you had was this really unique culture spring up where there is today a living language that's both Indigenous and European, right? It's got features of French, it's got features of Ojibwe and Cree, and it's emerged into something really beautiful that's still spoken today. And so that was an inspiration that was something that I wanted to bring into this world, that meeting of cultures. But of course, we don't have Europeans, we don't have that same dynamic, but we do have displacement. And we do have tribes from the north and from Canada that in the world of the game, that area of the continent is entirely covered in ice, right? We've got that permanent ice zone. So what happened to those people? And I didn't just want them to be lost. I didn't just want us to have wiped all that out. So we worked some of that history, and we had Ojibwe Cree people migrating south into what we have now as Cahokia and meeting these Lakota and other associated people in that region. And so the language Chahi emerged really first as a Creole between those Ojibwe and Algonquin languages and the Lakota and Dakota languages. So that's really the root of where the language emerges in game. And historically from the real world, it's meant to reflect the ways that Indigenous people have blended with their neighbors and have brought their languages together, and that pattern that we see all over the world. But we wanted to kind of shine a spotlight on that.
So now we're getting into some language specific questions, so like pronunciation and stuff. How would you pronounce vowels in Chahi?
Yeah, so where at all possible, one of my big goals with Chahi was making it easy for an English speaker to pronounce, but at the same time reflect real Indigenous phonology, right? So we wanted a language that was as uninfluenced by English as possible, but that was still going to be approachable and accessible for people who didn't have deep background with indigenous languages, because we know even a lot of indigenous people have lost that connection to language, and English is their first and mother tongue. So we wanted to make sure it wasn't intimidating. So for the most part, Ojibwe sounds like it's spelled. The vowels are essentially all monophthongs. They're all quote unquote pure vowels. With pronunciation, there's always going to be kind of a blurry line in some ways, and there's not really necessarily going to be a wrong way to pronounce these sounds, but we do have a general guide for how most people in Cahokia would pronounce these. And again, the goal was really to make it approachable. So we have 3 short vowels, 3 long vowels. We have I, O, A, and I, U, A. So those are the basic vowels that we have in the system. But again, you're going to see slightly different pronunciations of those. If you're pronouncing it at the table differently than I just did, that's fine. Because again, language is growing, it's an evolving thing. It's something that people take their own pronunciations with, and sometimes in really dramatic directions. We see that with English all over the world and the different dialects and accents, and we have the same thing in Coyote and Crow.
So this question is actually from the Discord community. Someone was curious, is Chahi structured subject, object, then verb, like a lot of the Siouan languages, or is it subject, verb, object?
Yeah, so like a lot of the languages, we borrowed from a lot of information in a Chahi sentence is encoded directly on the verb itself, right? There's a lot of suffixes, there's a lot of prefixes that tell you who's doing what, who they're doing it to, all those kind of things. And so we can actually be a little more fast and loose with verb order than a lot of other languages. It's called free word order, right? But there is a default, and that is subject, object, verb. So instead of saying the crow flew home, you'd say the crow home flew, to literally translate that into English.
I think that's really similar with a lot of like the indigenous languages, right? Like the verb is the root, and you kind of build out the sentence kind of around the verb.
Exactly.
Is there a difference between C and K in terms of pronunciation?
So no, for the most part, we're not using the word C in spelling except for the consonant CH. So if you do see a C, that's probably a good sign that it's not an original Chahi word, that it's coming from a different language or something else. Anytime you see one of those spelling variations, it's a good sign that that word is coming from outside of Chahi. It's a loan word or something like that. But for the most part, we just have K, and then if you see a C, it'll be CH.
Okay, and then we have 1, 2, 3. There are 6 words here that we were hoping to kind of get the proper pronunciation on. So the first one is AKALAW.
That's Akala.
And then AZAYANG.
Azayang.
BOCATA, and then the last A has a little accent on it.
Accent, yeah. So that is from the Confederacy of Bokata Ihonza, and that is not a Chahi original word. So that's not something that I brought to the language, but we were looking at kind of expanding, at least pointing out some of the other regions of the world. I think this is in Central or South America. So that was taken directly from some languages down there. So that's why you've got that accent, because I'm sure there's Spanish influence on how it's spelled and pronounced today.
Okay, this one I'm particularly curious about. So it looks like 2 words. So KAG and then a space and then NAAZHIIG. Yeah,
so that's Najik, and that ZH is just like Z or Z is the voiced version of S, right? So you say S or Z, and you can feel that if you touch the front of your throat when you're saying those 2 letters, you can feel your vocal cords vibrate when you say Z. Z. And so in the same way, the ZH is the voice version of SH, and that's a sound that we took directly from Algonquin languages. So sh to zh,
And then Kwachyapy.
Quachyapy. Quachyapy.
Last one is Pahtsi.
Patsy. And that's just a personal name. So I'm also not sure exactly which language that originally came from, but I'm sure that was one of our writers who, has an indigenous background again, and wanted to bring that particular word or that particular kind of sound and style into the language.
Nice. So if you were a character in the game, what path do you think you would take?
Yeah, I went back and forth with this for a while, but I think I really like the whisperer role. That's usually the kind of character I play in RPGs. I like to have that kind of face role in a party, so that whisper, that charisma-based path is the one that I'd be a fan of.
And then, what is your favorite weapon in the game?
I always look a little bit of distance, so I find anything that gets me a little bit of range is always something that I'm going to want to use. Yeah, so I think for me it's that recurve bow. Anything that gets me some range, recurve bow, that's where I'd be looking at.
Building my first character, I think I chose that one too. I'm a big fan of I'll stay over here and shoot at you over there.
Exactly. I don't need to get in the middle of it.
Okay, so we're on our last question. If you could have one piece of tech from the game in your real life, what would you choose to have?
I think that's got to be the GAD stuff. I love the ability to create really anything you can think of, and the way that has worked its way into the world and so fundamentally changed everything from just how the economy operates to how people with disabilities can engage in society and kind of remake the environment around them to be accessible instead of having to remake themselves. I really like that philosophically and just as a tool. I'm not a 3D printer. Maybe I'm not going to be smart enough to get the best use out of it, but if I could really take advantage of it, the GATs is what I'd want to use.
Yeah, they do sound really cool and just like super convenient.
Right.
So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us and answer all of our questions.
Of course. Thank you. Miigwech.
For those of you watching, make sure to stay tuned for more content like this. And we'll see you on the next video.